Thanks very much, Aaron, for your invitation, and thanks, Ruth, for hospitality in having me here. I'm going to read a 40-minute paper, but I thought, no, this is going to be sort of boring on, so I will try to talk to the PowerPoints rather than read, but if I get stuck, I'll read. In fact, memory's not being what it is, I'll have to read some of the bits. So I apologise for the pretentious title, but I fell upon this phrase, ontological dynamics, through my reading of Latour, and I thought, ontologies stay still, they move. So I thought you need this word dynamics, and maybe it's going to be useful for the kind of ethnographic work I'm doing in Broome, writing an ethnography with the Galarabaloo people. So I'm doing a kind of cultural analysis. And then, so persistence and interruption, I thought, well, they might work for this presentation. They may not work for the book as a whole. We'll see. Okay, so ontological dynamics. So if ontology is the study of what things are, basically, then the dynamic question is more pragmatic. If something is the way it is, how does it keep going the way it is? So ontologies can apply to anything in the universe, a concept, a mountain. They all persist in more or less. Mountains obviously more than fleeting feelings, but they all have qualities or capacities to keep going on their own peculiar trajectories through the world. And in the careers that objects, things, beings have as they go through the world, they find blockages, interruptions. They have to stop, make a leap in order to keep going. They don't just keep going smoothly. There are necessarily adaptations, changes. Take human reproduction. Humans take a risk by having a baby. How will it turn out, obviously? But the risk also gives the opportunity for change and evolution, and your children turn out differently from you are slightly. So that's a reproductive risk. And so it's part of the ontology of reproductive beings. Humans, also plants, anything really that persists in the way of reproducing. Okay, so you'd oppose this this pragmatic way of thinking about the way things are to something a bit more metaphysical. So I'm not interested in delving into the essence of things, what is deep down, internal. And then that internal definition of ontology often links it to something transcendental, a higher concept. The essence of things at their core and secondary layers might need to be peeled away. How do you find out what a thing really is deep down? You peel away the secondary layers and you get to the essence of the thing, and then relate it to some higher concept, and traditionally with Christian metaphysics, with a God figure. So that's how we get soul and God, get the internal and the external linked through Christian metaphysics. But because I want to move into a more dynamic direction and more pragmatic, then I'm talking about ontologies to which you add a description. Easy. What is something? You start describing it. You do it in writing or you do it in speech. As soon as you start a description, you're talking about the external relationships of a thing. Because we won't start to describe the inner essence of things. We can't get there. So you don't say that their primary qualities trump their secondary qualities. You describe everything in a description of a thing. And once you start down this track of describing stuff in the world, then you're doing ethnography, I reckon, how the things are moving through the world. So, yeah, how do they persist? And I'm getting a lot of these thoughts from Bruno Latour. I don't know if any of you, has anybody had? It's his, it's a philosophical anthropology. It's an anthropology of one particular mob he calls the moderns. The moderns are Western Europeans. He's doing what anthropologists promised for years they should really do, Western anthropologists. Why don't we study our own culture? And he's actually done it. And he does it through with a kind of fictional device. He has an American anthropologist arriving as if from Mars in Paris or somewhere very familiar to him in Western Europe, asking them, how do you go about things here? What do you really believe in this culture? And he does it through various institutions. So Latour quickly decides that in his anthropology of these moderns, he's not going to say what is your culture like or what is your society like. These terms are just too big, too clumsy and too, amorphous. He asks more focused questions about their institutions and how these institutions organise themselves. These institutions, like the legal system, like our scientific institutions, mostly in universities, like religious institutions that uphold morality, technological ones, engineering, all of those, he comes up with 15 odd modes of existence which are supported by institutional work, ones correspond to the Western European model and don't necessarily apply to other cultures. And they're the culmination of a number of empirical studies, a book on the law he did, a book on science studies. He's done a book on religion. And so they're the more empirical books he did, but this is the more philosophical work that he produced only 3 years ago. Okay, so it's got an institutional focus. Because you can describe what institutions get up to. He has his anthropologist in an imaginary fashion going into institutions of the law and asking people how they go about doing things. And like a typical anthropologist, finds that the people she's speaking to will say one thing and do something else. They claim that their work is totally pure within that institution. For instance, like especially scientific ones, where Latour cut his teeth in California working at the Salk Institute. How do you go about your work in the laboratory? He would ask people, and they'd say, well, we do science, and science has got certain very well-established methods. And Latour, being cheeky, would say, but didn't I see a lawyer in here yesterday talking to your committee about a patent for a certain device that you were trying to market? And wasn't there a business person at that table? And now you're telling me that you do pure scientific work in this institution? And so I have to admit, yes, we do have dealings with lawyers, and so there are crossings over among institutions that kind of muddy the water and make the anthropologist investigating the Western moderns conclude that, well, when they say they're doing pure science, it's actually not pure. It's a bit mixed up with other stuff, and we'll have to look into the ways in which it gets confused in that respect. But anyway, I can't go into the whole Latour business because it is, a very big book full of lots of chapters. But in a sense, he's done the right thing and said, us moderns, talking for himself, should know better what we really care about, that we're built up these public institutions to do really well. And once we've determined what we really care about in our society, then we're in a position to make a bit of a post-colonial leap and dialogue with cultures, other civilizations, and talk about what we might have in common when we're faced with serious problems that the whole planet is facing. And that's why Latour has become picked up in a big way by by all sorts of environmental issues, climate change, so on and so forth. Okay, so different sorts of institutions. I'm going to take up his challenge, take that as a kind of anthropological description of the moderns, take it to Broome in Western Australia, and look at that series of institutions, assuming that these moderns, as he calls them, settlers brought to Australia, more or less, and assume that the Gallara Baloo mob have a different set of institutions. See, I like the way I can avoid saying it's a culture, it's an Aboriginal culture. I can say, well, you can say it's an Aboriginal culture, but you say it's composed of a number of institutions which support different ontologies, ways of being in the world. Not the same ones as the moderns, obviously. The settler moderns, a different set, which find themselves in dialogue in different ways. That's how I'm going to try to compose my own ethnography as a kind of dialogue among institutions, sometimes clashes amongst these institutions, different ways of going through the world, organising people and non-humans. According to what these institutions have got going. I've got a little colloquial phrase which I kind of like. What's an institution got going for its attributes? And you could spell them out just through doing an ethnography of an institution. This is how the law works, this is what it... Avoid the question of what it is and what it does. Avoid the question of what it is, but ask what it does, according to what sorts of attributes, qualities, values they espouse, and then organise into motion for keep doing what the law does. It can't suddenly become religious, can it? Hence, take over Sharia law, that sort of thing. Hence the division of church and state. The law has to keep going as the law, and lawyers are very conscious of when they step out of line, and they're highly trained to stay in line. And so the ethnographer of an institution like the law should be able to come to some understanding fairly quickly about procedures, modes of organisation, values and practices in that particular institution. But then what if you come leap across the cultural divide and come across an Australian Aboriginal law that in Broome is called Bugaragara. And how does that work? Well, that's a totally different thing. But at least with the Latour schema, looking at different modes of existence and now looking at them cross-culturally, in principle I should be in a position across two different kinds of law, across two different kinds of religious or set of sacred practices, different ways of doing science, and so on. So it's an ontological, it's a plural ontology. There is not just one world. These two different sets of institutions have in common. They're engaging with each other and trying to find common ground, but there is no common ground given in advance. Even nature is not sitting there as a common thing that we all share. I mean, that's a pretty radical Latourian move to say there's no such thing as nature, but he's not the only one to say it. Philippe Descola, famous French anthropologist, has got a book, Beyond Nature and Culture. His work with Amazonian peoples pretty easily establishes that if he asks those people about nature, they have no answer for him. We don't have a concept like that. Yes, but you're dealing with trees and animals all the time. Yes, we deal with trees and animals all the time. Ensemble of stuff out there, nature, as separate from what we humans do over here. We have intimate relations with things that you say are in nature, but we don't have that general concept. So no common ground. No common ground, but different institutions supporting different modes of existence that can dialogue with each other and work towards a common ground on which they could try to figure out how to go forward in some more post-colonial way, a way where you're not assuming that the universalism that was Western modernity can continue to impose itself as a template on other peoples who weren't yet gifted with that Western modernity, or actively opposed it, or said, hang on a sec, we've got a Chinese civilization here that, you know, maybe it was being modern in its own ways long before the hegemony of the Western European thing started to export itself with a lot of confidence about how it was a template for progress, a template for being modern. Okay, so this ontologically plural situation, which makes things a bit complicated, but accepts that there is a possibility of respectful dialogue only between modes of existence and their supporting institutions, but across cultures where common ground might be able to be composed or constructed. Okay, so that kind of dialogue among modes of existence or different institutions is respectful in the sense that you don't not the other. Okay, so that if you could look at, an example might be religion versus sociology, religion versus social science. Social scientists being typically secular, an understanding of what's going on in the world, and they might look at a simple device like a condom and say it's a device for inhibiting the spread of AIDS. Catholic Church might say, well, no, that little device is actually a sin against human fertility. They're both right, of course, aren't they? I mean, if you're respectful to the two institutions, you have to say, well, you're both right. And it's also the case that one could trump the other in different times and places, that the social scientific explanation with medical stuff added to it can override the sin against human fertility, and likewise in the other direction, if they weren't respectful of each other's modes of existence. So that would be a case of conflict and possible one side winning in particular cases, depending where you are. But in general, all the social science in the world has not managed to eliminate the church, the Western church. Those churches are still going strong, flourishing. I think I used to imagine they'd disappear. But no, Buddhism going very strongly, Catholicism, they have beautiful ceremonies and so on and so forth. So they're a religious mode of existence, and they have their own truth going for them. So these modes that Latour is studying has its own truth conditions and felicity conditions. Being a religious person, going through the world in a religious fashion means you respond in a certain way to certain ways in which the church addresses you. But those truths are completely different from the truths to which a social scientist conducts his or her work as they go through their institution, i.e. a place like this. Okay, so that's sort of my introduction. I now want to get a little bit more practical and descriptive. Sorry? But just as a footnote, the question of attributes or things that one has. I just a bit before about how I didn't want to talk about the essence of ontologies, what ontologies are, but what they, what keeps them going. And I thought maybe attributes is a way in which you could explore that. And Gabriel Tarde, who was kind of Durkheim's nemesis. So sociology has inherited the Durkheimian tradition, but Gabriel Tarde was there on the wings, losing out in that particular intellectual battle. But of course Latour has revived him and likes him, and particularly liked one of his ideas, which was replace the verb to be with the verb to have. which is where I get my phrase, what's it got going for it? Ask that question about an Indigenous institution like the Dreaming, what's it got going for it? Ask that question in Indigenous Australia and think they get the idea through attributes and I think linguists of Australian languages would say that most of them don't even have the copula, the verb to be anyway. And so maybe in Indigenous philosophies, people aren't pondering existentialist questions like Jean-Paul did. Who am I? What is existence? But perhaps more practically, thinking about what have things got and expressing this in languages with particular suffixes, like a Central Australian language with tjara as a comitative suffix, something. But the linguists will know much more about that than me and maybe can correct me on that. But I thought it was just kind of wonderful to try to take the concept of existence into Aboriginal Australia and watch it sink as like the famous Hamlet monologue, to be or not to be is not really the question that you ask and maybe untranslatable into Indigenous languages. But anyway, that's just a footnote about and as Tarde expresses it, the passion or the avidity of what is it you really want? Or, if you're talking institutionally, what does the law really want? What is it really aiming towards? What's it passionate about? Justice, perhaps, but that's outside of the law. So now to my more practical 4 modes of existence I'm going to look at. But I'm going to start, before getting onto those, I want to ask about where, if you're doing this descriptive work and describing what's going on in institutions and the way they're organising themselves, where are you doing this from if you're an ethnographer? How are you positioning yourself? Where do you stand, sit or walk? And I'm arguing here that it's not by putting yourself in a position of saying, I am interpreting the world, that you're doing this. As if you could stand at a distance or as if the world were a singular thing anyway. Already I've divided it up into multiple ontologies, and so then I don't know where to turn, like am I in church or am I in the subject to the law or doing something else, and how do I move around amongst these different modes of being? And I've nonetheless decided, yes, I won't take that authoritative, overarching position, and I'm not the only person who tries to avoid this omniscient or authoritative thing. But not assume that the world is making itself available to this position, not assume that is divided into the objective over there and the subjective over here in my head, as if the brain were the privileged place where these things were getting sorted out. No, the world is getting on fine without my brain standing there watching. Those procedures go on anyway. But I can take my brain in there and try to partially look at what's going on partially. And when I do that, I'm not somebody interpreting the world at all. I'm looking at worlds for a start. I'm looking at bits of them. I want to talk of myself as somebody who's rather in charge of translation devices and being very practical about ethnographic work. I look in my kit bag and say, what's in it? And yes, I have translation devices, actual technology. I've got a voice recorder, a pen and notebook, maybe a movie camera, still camera. Maybe I use other senses like smell and touch, but then I've got to translate them into writing. So I might, 1,000 words is not enough. The camera frames the scene in a certain way. It puts a rectangular frame around it. It reintroduces that perspective I was trying to get rid of, that authoritative perspective from over here towards over there. So if I decide to prioritize the translation devices as technologies and as mediating devices, then I'm abandoning the notion that the subject is an endpoint in a process leading from object to subject. Just another relay. My notebook becomes a writing which then gets sent to another audience. So it's being translated for them into a language that I think they will understand better, and then that gets mediated yet again if it gets transmitted further from that point. The ethnographic situation is looking even messier, as these various mediations can cross each other, create networks, can create multiple versions of the same event. My notebook is not saying the same thing as my camera, they're contradicting each other. And in the process of those different kinds of mediation, then I might be building up different kinds of realities that align with those multiple ontologies. So if I'm asking the Galarabaloo mob about a particular tree, like a gatgur, I could translate it into long-fruited bloodwood, Eucalyptus polycarpa, and continue with that Linnaean type of classification, reality building in that Linnaean sense. While another strand of its that connects to it, literally connects to it, is its role in ceremony. And that particular verity that I could by unnoticed if I was obsessed with Linnaean classification and with translating it into the Latin name. Or it could be interrupted by something else, like the voice recorder runs out of batteries, or there might have been an interruption further down the track, like some other kind of interruption, like my funding gets cut off, or publishers refuse to publish my mad ethnographies. So doing ethnography then and dealing with multiple ontologies is being wary of not ruling out other possible strands in event making, all of which are works of mediation and translation. And at the same time wonder how things keep going despite various interruptions. In the case of this tree, it could be some ignorant bastard coming along and bulldozing it. Bulldozing at the same time its important role in relation to the adjacent law ground. Now, I got the concept of interruption through having Aaron Burton helping out as we were doing experimental ethnography, and he's making a film. And if he hadn't made a film, Sunset Ethnography, which some of you saw the other night, and we'll see another clip from now, if he hadn't made a film, I wouldn't have meditated on an episode in the film which illustrates interruption. So if we could show that 5 minutes.
What about a different understanding of the representation of theory itself in its relationship to what I'll call raw life? That seems to be very important to me, that the theory isn't like a flag that's nailed to the experiences, but has a much more sinuous relationship, often barely visible.
Yeah, well, it does, I think. Like from Michel Foucault, I gleaned the idea of the specific intellectual, and I found I could immediately say, yeah, well, this is what my friend Paddy Rowe is. He's not a general intellectual, he's one who works through specific situations, and his techniques were storytelling techniques. He persuaded people. Mm-hmm. He did his politics through seduction. And
G'day. Just the woman that owns this block's just inquiring as to what you're doing here.
Teresa?
Teresa, yeah.
Yeah, she knows me well.
Does she?
Yeah. Tell her it's
right.
Steve.
Tell her?
Steve.
Steve?
Yeah.
Steve's here?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Is that all I need to say?
I think so.
She'd be... Oh, yeah, she was a bit miffed. She's just spotted somebody under the tree. She couldn't see who it was.
Oh.
Okay.
Tell her I'm a little sorry.
I said, yeah, no, I asked, did they get permission? She says, I don't know who is it?
Yeah, I didn't know you needed permission.
Yeah, all right.
I worked with Olulu years ago in this spot. This is why I came back here.
Oh, yeah. No, that's okay. Steve, no, nothing else is needed?
Yeah, tell us, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. Yeah. Okay then. Steve. No worries.
What about the place of pictures and images in the story? That would seem to me important in developing the experimental ethnography.
Yeah, well, all I can think about them is their role as mediators. They're not illustrations. They open another window, another mediation. So that's not about I am interpreting the world, but. Hi there. How are you? Hey.
Hey!
Hello.
Good to see you!
Yeah.
Oh, good to see you, Steve. Been a long time.
Yeah. Only last year.
Okay, so Mick Tausig and I are carrying on about experimental ethnography, talking some sort of theory. And luckily we get interrupted in a way that illustrates a fundamental rule for being on Galaribaloo country, which is you've got to ask permission. And I thought I didn't have to ask permission because I'd been there a million times before. But no, it's the person who has the rights who is recognised as the person to whom you have to ask permission. So that's why she's a bit miffed, Teresa, and comes up and says hello and everything's fine. But what's good about the interruption is that Mick and I thought we had a little system going, which is talking theory, talking anthropology. But it's a nervous, as he would say in his book, The Nervous System, it's nervous, it's inherent, it's got its inherent instability, which at any moment could be interrupted by another strand, which is literally Galaribaloo reality intersecting with it, interrupting it, and it lurches. We have a conversation with Teresa, if you watch the movie, where she starts talking about struggles for country, land rights, struggle with the mining company, and then we get back on track and carry on with our conversation. But we are able to persist in our institutional configuration, while she has succeeded in inserting her institutional mode of existence across ours, and that's a strand that will be picked up later if the ethnography does what the ethnography should do and pay attention to it. And so pay attention to the world in a multiple fashion rather than in a singular fashion, rather than the anthropologist observing from here over to there. These two cross here, but then there could be 3, 4 other crossings along the way. I don't have that much more time, so I'm going to move on to those 4 ways and just describe briefly how I think I'll try to confront the Bugada with the law. These modes of existence as modes of belonging, and, not so much existence, not so much to be, but to have belonging, what they've got going for them. Bugada, science, politics and law, as they change or get rebooted in the conflict of Woodside Petroleum versus the Galaribaloo. Now, of course, Bugada has existed for, well, who knows how long, thousands and thousands of years. It's a word, dreaming word that you get anywhere else in. I mean, it's not the same word, it's the same sort of concept. One is struck by how cliched the usual definitions of dreamings are. An ancient religious charter which serves to endow. It's almost like a religious litany. And says from that cliche version of what a dreaming is, for me, is all wrong, because it's not just ancient, it's also contemporary. You don't divide natural and social worlds because they're necessarily connected through dreamings. It's not necessarily about meaning, and so on and so forth. But no doubt about it, Bulgara Gada has survived. And it's still central in Indigenous thought across a number of different institutions in Broome. So the Kimberley Land Council, which found itself kind of in a conservative and pro-industrialisation position in relation to this particular gas plant fight, the Kimberley Land Council says on its website that it is upholding law and culture and, you know, the usual traditional law and culture. We get all our cues from our elders, but in their day-to-day organisation of this beautiful new building funded by the Barnett government, they don't do law and culture in the way that the Dora does law and culture, which means actually do ceremony once a year or twice a year with boys. So that persists, and the other Indigenous people who might have felt as if they'd been missing out on a strong connection with Bulgara Gada do their very best in the context of battling for native title to revive their attendance of ceremony, to do things that are seen as connecting with this powerful institution called Bulgara Gada, which has persisted through the ages and has been interrupted, has had some of its attributes torn off it, and perhaps some new ones added, but it persists through its in its own way. I would like to define it more along the lines of a institution that transforms boys into men by inscribing them in a cosmic configuration that includes multi-species identity, used to be called totems, knowledge of songs, stories and iconography as laid out by ancestors who first travelled the country. Okay, so that I think is a slightly better definition of Bulgara Gada, but if I wanted a really good definition, I probably should translate it, write it up in English, and take maybe a whole book, several books, maybe books that take as long to read as a ceremony takes to perform. Days. And maybe that's not enough. It's still in English. And so you need to listen to people like this tell you what Bulgara Gada is. When he says law, that's Bulgara Gada, law. I think English say dream time, but we say Bulgara Gada, law, and then starts drawing in the dust with his finger. This is Bulgara Gada, he says. And this is where the white people came. So that kind of practice is very different from what the KLC is doing, or what I do when I try to write down in English what I think Bulgara Gada is. And then it comes across this word that Paddy Rowe is using, law, and it comes across the whitefellow institutions of the law, and they say, okay, now do we have grounds? Do we have grounds? And they start to translate it with words like grounds for a case. How can we put these concerns that you have according to your law and turn them into grounds for a viable case under native title law that will respond to the criteria, what are the words for native title law, that will work, that will make a case. So they work on creating a common ground. But enough to say, you know, because I'm running out of time, that this is a sacred mode of existence that is not something you can see, but it comes and goes, it kind of flickers in and out of existence, but it works and persists through the maximum possible transformations that are engendered on the people who go through it. Like a boy gets turned into a man. The ancestor beings turn into stars, or maximum transformation, and make it all plausible. It's the kind of knowledge system that can do that. And it does have its passions, and it is possible to change it as you go slightly. Science is on the other hand, and here I'm looking at the role of largely citizen scientists in the gas plant dispute up in and around Broome, over those years, started to divide them up into public science as the kind of science we do in universities, which is generally available, private science, which is done for corporations and may not be even publishable because they own the intellectual property, and citizen science, which is done by people who may be more or less qualified with the qualifications of public science, like university training, but have reliable methodologies and might work on the same sort of territory as the public scientists or the private scientists. Those three were able to dialogue sometimes they were in conflict, and my discussions with people involved was able to establish that a number of different criteria started to emerge as citizen scientists dialogued with traditional ecological knowledge, or so it's like, just in broad brush strokes, it's like a model of the privatized science that brings in scientists at great expense for a short period of time. With the clock ticking, you have to have finished the job. You might say, talking to Madeline Goddard, we didn't finish, but Matt there, counting them over months and months and months, putting in the time, and also talking to traditional owners. Or talking about, Madeline says, talking about turtles, and talking to the private scientists who say, oh, that's too rocky for nesting on that beach there. So they disregarded all those beaches, she says, where a lot of turtles do nest. Whereas we went, talking to the traditional owner, hey, Phil, where are the turtles? And he went, oh, they're from here to here. And so he designed our methodology encompassing that traditional knowledge of where the turtles were. And so they found them. So two different ways, three different kinds of whitefellow science, but also the input from Indigenous scientists, should we call them that, who also create what whitefellow science wants to carry on as its mode of existence. In other words, reliable knowledge that will persist through time and space over great distance and the creation of reliability through repetition, through experiments, through recording. Phil's knowledge of where the turtles were is also highly reliable because his family has gone there for turtle eggs for generations. It's also creating reliability, but not with numbers and recording devices. It's not counting. But the important thing for the rebooting of the whitefellow sciences, the modern sciences, is that they can do a number of things in their dialogue with the traditional owners. They can, for a start, treat them as peers, colleagues in an investigation, and make their results consequently more reliable than those of the private scientists. They had that collegiality, and they could also learn methodologies like being alert. Not assuming, like the private scientists could assume, that if we fly over there in a helicopter, we're bound to see the bilbies nesting. Well, I need to spend a lot more time on the country, months, and with traditional owners who see things, who are alert to what's going on. So paying attention is, well, any good scientist is alert to stuff that they're not the scientists to be interrupted in their usual expectations or surprised, cuts through this mode of existence as well. One, politics is also a mode of existence. It's not like, it too has its truths, but they're not like the truths of the social sciences. We can't really apply the truth criteria of history and sociology to what Tony Abbott does. We try to but that in a sense doesn't matter for politics, because politics is a mode of creating knowledge that goes in circles and is recreated every news cycle. You can forget yesterday's lies, because if you're doing what politics is supposed to do, you're supposed to get the numbers and increase the numbers. Attract people to your position and hold them there. So that if you can do that, you're being a good politician. Forget about telling the truth in that sense. I mean, sure, we apply those criteria to them and condemn them for not telling the truth, but they've got, at the heart of what they're doing is a different thing from what an historian or a sociologist does, or for that matter, a priest. Okay, so they're moving in cycles, they repeat themselves continually, they're continually finding a new audience, they're trying to gather that audience into their sphere, and huge risks, like Colin Barnett, WA Premier, did when he said, James' price point is scrub, it's tableland, flat as a table, an unremarkable beach. And as soon as he said that, people heard him and he lost votes. And the Greens candidate during that election nearly won the day with 38% of the vote. Not just because of that little blunder, but it was a blunder. It was a blunder that interrupted what might have been a progression of his politics, gathering numbers, so on and so forth. But it's a risky business, this political business, constantly at the risk of losing numbers. And he did when he said that that coastline was unremarkable. Last one. The law could be the common ground on which and English common law meet, and it could be the common ground on which parties who are in dispute meet, like even scientists can take each other to courts of law over issues. But this is also the domain in which native title law gets fought out, and there are competing Indigenous groups going for the same stretch of country that's subject to my ethnography. The law is, in Western system, very ancient, very conservative. It deals only with the things it can take action upon, which is why they talk in terms of it doesn't necessarily proceed in a straight, linear fashion. I have a case against so-and-so, my neighbour, who's doing something bad across the fence. Do I have a case? And the lawyer would do a few convolutions of legal language to find out if there is something that will engage with the statutes that are already there, which can then be acted upon, and with you, whether or not you'll be likely to win this case. So in the process of doing that, it bears out any human passions that might have been involved in your dispute with your neighbour. But it's passionate about something else, which is that the law should proceed according to the way it's supposed to proceed, which is why we tend to call them conservative. But in a sense, thank goodness, they're not being buffeted around like people in a political mode of existence are. They have to stick to their configurations, but nonetheless are open to innovation, as in the case of setting precedents with new judgments. Okay, so I had a final thing to say about the law, but I've lost it. I've run out of time anyway. The law, there are two systems that, and it gets particularly interesting when the law crosses with other modes of existence, like in native title law, anthropological, social scientific testimony finds itself tested in that form, so that it's what you thought was really good anthropology, when taken to a court of law, gets attacked by a person counsel, and they might point out faults, inconsistencies epistemene. That's why Paul Burke has written a book called Law's Anthropology, where he starts his book talking about the bruises that anthropologists have when they come out of native title cases. So I think that's an interesting case of these two modes of existence that don't quite match up with each other, but find themselves tested in this public forum. And likewise, the law finds itself tested when it comes to Indigenous customary law. English common law, great, everybody loves it, but when it tries to deal with the ancient laws of the country, it's not working. So we're going to have to invent something new. We're going to have to compromise, invent something called native title law, or include aspects of customary law, reforms in ways in which a modern institution, which is also very ancient, development situation can be rebooted with the inclusion of what it's learned. Corrupted by those Indigenous people who said, your law is very well, but it doesn't work for us. And they have to listen. And they said that. And likewise with those other modes of existence, they too have to be. The scientists also have to say, what we're doing here in Indigenous countries with Indigenous animals and life forms isn't quite working. Maybe we should open our methodology to be able to deal with what TOs are saying and turn them into colleagues. And Madeline did that, and NGO like Environments Kimberley and Broome did that. So they're at the cutting edge of a new rebooted environmental science that is working with TOs. So likewise with the other modes of existence, they're all rebootable in that same way. Okay, thanks for listening.